Rosemary wished you Happy New Year, and it's still appropriate to wish you Merry Christmas, isn't it? Because this is what? Epiphany, the 12th day of Christmas. So Merry Christmas to you. This morning, our lesson focuses on holding fast to God's love as we begin in this new year. Our text is from Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, the 3rd chapter, the first 5 verses, and I'll read that. Finally, brothers and sisters, pray for us so that the word of the Lord may spread rapidly and be glorified everywhere, just as it is among you, and that we may be rescued from wicked and evil people. For not all have faith. But the Lord is faithful. He will strengthen you and guard you from the evil one. And we have confidence in the Lord concerning you that you are doing and will go on doing the things that we command. May the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and to the steadfastness of Christ. Let's pray. God, you reached out so many years ago to the Magi in Persian, people who were outside the covenant of Israel, and you drew them, stirred their hearts to come to Bethlehem. We pray that the same spirit that worked in their hearts and the star that guided them there, that you would, by your spirit, bring us each day into your loving and holy presence, that we may worship you in spirit and in truth, and that you may transform us in a way that is pleasing to you. In Jesus' name, amen. When I was a child, we had a device, and many of you probably did, called a Viewmaster. You remember the Viewmasters? Compared to the technology that children have now, it pales in comparison, doesn't it? It's just a little manually operated device, had this wheel of a thing that you stuck down in there. I was thrilled to death to have that. I thoroughly enjoyed that, getting each new wheel of a thing. And what that device did was to give stereoscopic views of things. It was designed in such a way that one eye saw one perspective, the other eye saw the other perspective, and the result was an in-depth, sort of a three-dimensional look at what you were looking at. This morning I'm going to do something like that in our focus on 2 Thessalonians. We have Luke's version of Paul's going to Thessalonica in the Acts of the Apostles, and then we have the 2 letters of Paul, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so I'll be drawing on those and trying to give us a stereoscopic view of this 5-verse text that we've looked at. Paul made his way to Thessalonica after a wonderful and a very difficult time in the city of Philippi in Macedonia. Philippi was a Roman colony, and he and Silas and Timothy ran afoul of the law in Philippi and were accused of teaching things that were contrary to and in violation of Roman law. There was not due process. They were convicted without much evidence. They were flogged and incarcerated. And because of an earthquake at midnight, they were freed pretty quickly from the incarceration. And I think all of those events brought to the minds of the leaders of Philippi that they had been falsely accused. And Paul told them the next day after they had been incarcerated, he said, by the way, we are Roman citizens. and their eyes got wide and they realized that it was very inappropriate to not go through due process with these men, and so they freed them and asked them to get out of town. And so they headed south in a south-southerly direction toward Thessalonica. I'm going to pass out a map here. I've got 4 versions of it. On this map, you will see a major Roman road called the Via Egnatia. It runs all the way from what we call Istanbul today in the east, up near the Black Sea, runs all the way west to the Adriatic Sea to Dyrrhachium. And that road was built in the 2nd century before Christ as a way for the Romans to extend their influence east from Rome. A person could travel, let's say from Istanbul all the way to Rome by taking the Via Egnatia. And when they got to Dyrrhachium, there on the west coast of Greece, they could then board a ship, cross over the Adriatic Sea, and take the Via Appia, or the Appian Way, on up to Rome. So you'll see on that map the geographical relationship between Philippi and Thessalonica, where Paul went to minister after they had to leave Philippi. It was likely, their ministry in Philippi was likely from August through October, and so they would be leaving for Thessalonica in late October or early November. Thessalonica is a beautiful place that time of year in late October, early November. However, the temperature begins to fall to about low 40s overnight, and in the 50s, mid-50s, say, in the daytime. There's a cold northern wind that sweeps from the northwest, and they've even named this wind the Verdaris, that picks up strength. And in addition, the weather conditions that Paul and Silas would have faced would have had lots of rain, because in that area it rains about a third of the time in October and November. And so they probably picked up the pace as they moved along the Via Egnatia to Thessalonica, so that they didn't have to spend as much time in those adverse windy and rainy conditions. The city of Thessalonica, as they approached it, was 350 years old at the time. You recall that when Alexander the Great died, his 4 generals divided the empire. One of those generals was Cassander, and he was married to Alexander the Great's half-sister. Her name was Thessalonica, and so Cassander named this city for his wife, Thessalonica. Thessalonica is the major port city of Macedonia. It's situated on the Thermaic Gulf. In fact, it's called, Thessalonica is called the bride of the Thermaic Gulf. And that gulf is basically contiguous with the Aegean Sea. So I think maybe on the map that you're seeing, you will see Aegean Sea all the way up to the port of Thessalonica. It was a religiously diverse city at that time, bustling with commerce, because as a port city and as a city connected to a major highway in those days, it was a place that commerce that was easy for commerce and supported commerce in a nice way. It was also a city that became a Roman province in 146 BC and had strong ties to Rome. This factor will be important in what we look at in just a few minutes. When Paul and Silas, Timothy, arrived in Thessalonica, there were two venues primarily in which they worked. They worked in a Jewish synagogue and in the marketplace. The city had to have 10 Jewish men in order to constitute a synagogue, so we know that there were a good number of Jews already in Thessalonica. The audience in the synagogue would have been primarily Jews, but also devout Greeks. A lot of Greek people were being attracted, a lot of Gentiles were being attracted to the Jewish faith. They would not become fully Jewish by adopting the food laws and other practices of the Jews, but they found the worship of God as the Jews did it much more appealing, much more reasonable than the old Greek and Roman gods that they had grown up with. A third section of the synagogue, as you look at the faces around there, in addition to the Jews and devout Greeks, would be women of high standing in Thessalonica. These women would constitute 1 or maybe even less than 1% of the population, but from city to city across the Roman Empire, women of high standing, wealthy women, women married to the leading men of the city, were attracted to the gospel, attracted to the message of Paul and other apostles. And these women in turn became very significant in the development of Christianity across the Mediterranean. We think of a woman like Lydia in Philippi, and next month we'll talk a little more about her. There's also a woman near the Corinthian church named Chloe, who was from the upper class and that Paul relied on to do some very important things. So these women were a significant part of the development of Christianity. What would have been Paul's message as he spoke in the synagogue there in Thessalonica? He would have reviewed a history that was familiar to the Jewish people and was increasingly known to the Gentile men and women in the synagogue. That is, how God began with one man, Abraham, created a family that became a nation. He would talk about Moses and the Exodus, Joshua and the taking of the land of Israel, the period of the Judges, and David. And then he would probably skip from David to the Messiah, the son of David that was prophesied to come. Paul in his message would have gone into the Hebrew Bible, to the prophetic parts of it. He would draw out the various prophetic parts, and he would say to them, just a few years ago, these very prophecies were fulfilled over in the Eastern Mediterranean in a man, Jesus of Nazareth. And he would narrate the story of Jesus growing up, his teachings, his healings, his unjust death at the hands of leaders, his resurrection, the ascension of Jesus, and the coming of the Holy Spirit on the apostles. He would likely cite evidence for the resurrection that would have been important to the Greeks. The Greeks were a people who valued reason highly. And so he would have pointed out that there were eyewitness appearances from people like Peter, the 12, James, the brother of Jesus, and 500 brothers and sisters at one time to whom the risen Christ appeared. Paul likely also gave his personal testimony. He would have told these Jewish people and the Greeks in the synagogue, I didn't believe this at first. This didn't match up with what I expected God to be doing based on the Hebrew scripture. But on a road to Damascus, my whole perspective was turned around when I encountered the living Christ directly. I witnessed the risen Christ. And so my whole life was turned upside down. Now, as Paul preached in the synagogue, there was something that happened that is vital then and is as vital in 2019 as it was then, and that was that the Holy Spirit took his words and amplified them in the minds and the hearts and to the will of these listeners in the synagogue. He reminds them in his first letter to the Thessalonians that the message came not with just words, but with power in the Holy Spirit and with conviction to you. And so, as a result of Paul's preaching and his the Spirit's presence in the believers or the hearers there, they became believers. Paul's other place of working with the people in Thessalonica was in the marketplace. He was a leather craftsman by trade. All Jewish men, all Jewish boys were expected to learn a trade so that they could support themselves. That was an important part of the Jewish ethic. And so Paul's family had been leather workers, and he reminds the Thessalonians that he worked night and day in this leather working business, in addition to his conversations with them and his preaching in the synagogue, so that they would not have to support him. He supported himself, Silas and Timothy, through the leather goods that he sold. And this work in the marketplace, in his leather business, gave him an opportunity for one-on-one relationships with the Thessalonians. This was as important as his preaching in the synagogue. Paul is often pictured as a person with his head in the clouds and not very relational, but as you read the text of 1 Thessalonians, you'll see what a tremendous pastor, what a tremendous pastoral heart Paul had. He was gentle with these people, and he uses some amazing terminology that bears this out. He speaks of being like them, being like a nurse, tenderly caring for her own children, and like a father who urges, encourages, and pleads with his children in the directions that their life takes. So he had not only this relationship as a preacher, teacher, but as a friend. And so there were very strong, loving relationships built with these people in Thessalonica. We had a message of vertical love, God's love through his Son, but you had that expressed in the horizontal love of him with the Thessalonians. All of this resulted in a crisis in Thessalonica. people began to follow Paul and his teaching about Jesus as Messiah. And this created a backlash among some in the synagogue and others in the city of Thessalonica. The Jews, Luke says, were jealous, some of the Jews in the synagogue, and so they criticized Paul and urged others to separate from him. But there was another factor there, in addition to the Jews in the synagogue, and that was what I would call a civic cult in Thessalonica, a strong Roman cult. So the Jews that were in strong disagreement with Paul, along with the people of the civic cult, went to the marketplace and they enlisted what one translation calls ruffians to come and create a riot within Thessalonica. They began searching for Paul and Silas. Apparently, after 3 weeks in the synagogue, they had to move what Paul was doing to the home of a man named Jason. And so they went to Jason's house to look for them and deal with them. But Paul and Silas were not there. So they dragged Jason and some other believers out and took them before what's called the politarchs, or the leaders, the administrative leaders of Thessalonica. Politarchs is a term that some scholars believe that Luke made up for in the Acts of the Apostles. But in the 19th century, there was an inscription found in Thessalonica that had the word politarchs in it. So it was a genuine term. And here's the charge that these people of the civic cult and the Jews from the synagogue brought before the politarch. They said this: "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are acting all contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." So you have a critical mass developing here with the interests of the zealous Jews and the zealous people with strong Roman ties. Now, what imperial or decrees of the Caesar might they be talking about that Paul was in violation against? In AD 16, Tiberius, who was the emperor at that time, issued an injunction against magicians and astrologers who practiced divination, because in this process of making predictions about the future, they would often talk about the overturn of power. And so Caesars were very concerned when people began to talk about overturning leadership in the empire. That was a long time ago, AD 16. There were loyalty oaths across the empire that had to be taken. One such loyalty oath was found in Paphlagonia, which is up in present-day Turkey. And politarchs, like these in Thessalonica, were responsible for administering loyalty oaths to the Romans and to non-Romans alike, as well as receiving complaints about violations of those oaths. This one that was found in Paphlagonia is as follows: "I swear that I will support Caesar Augustus, his children, and his descendants throughout my life in word, deed, and thought. That is, whatever concerns them, I will spare neither body, soul, or life, that whenever I see or hear of anything being said, planned, or done against them, I will report it, and whomever they regard as enemies, I will attack. and will pursue with arms and sword by land and sea. So this oath that was during the reign of Caesar Augustus gives you a sense of the kind of loyalty oaths that were still being administered in the Roman Empire, and how seriously they took the oaths and violation of the oaths. Now, some of you have been in schools, or you've been in military units, or even in corporations where oaths had to be taken not to do certain things or to do certain things. And in taking those oaths, you had to agree also that when you saw violations of that, you would report it to the authorities. The honor codes in some schools are like that. In the corporation where I worked, once a year, we had to reaffirm an oath related to the practice of procurement, the practice or the matter of sexual harassment. We had principles dealing with how procurement was to be done and about the matter of sexual harassment. And you may not be guilty yourself of these, but if you saw those and you knew of them, you were as guilty as a person who was involved in that. So we understand these kind of oaths that people have to take. And so it was in the Roman Empire. And this is the kind of thing that, I mean, this is fairly early in Paul's ministry, but this kind of reality is something that he would live with throughout his ministry. The reason the people could not find Paul and Silas is that the Thessalonian believers had the foresight to get them out of town. They sensed what was coming, and they took them to Berea, which is not on the Via Ignatia. It's on a secondary road, and they began a ministry there that was bearing fruit. Also in Berea, you have, Luke mentions that the leading women of the city were attracted to the gospel message. But the intensity of the opposition of the people in Thessalonica was so great that they traveled all the way to Berea to search for Paul and Silas. And the Berean believers, again, had foresight about this, and they took Paul to the coast, and he boarded a ship. They boarded a ship with him, traveled with him all the way to Athens. So you can see the loyalty that Paul drew from those who had become believers. They cared about him and wanted to make sure that he would be safe. We come back to what happened after Paul went to Athens. Would his work be for naught in Thessalonica? He dispatched Timothy to stay in Thessalonica and to assess the situation for him. Timothy must have been there for some time, because he did not meet up with Paul in Athens, but Corinth, which was the next place that Paul served. Paul then wrote his first letter to Thessalonica, encouraging them, and then he wrote a second letter from which our core text appears. And there in that second letter is the one where he asked for the prayer of the brothers and sisters in Thessalonica. It's interesting that a man who was an apostle would seek the intercession of people who were fairly young believers. But this shows the confidence that Paul had in these young believers. And that kind of confidence is important in their own development. He valued them praying for him. And so we ask the question, was the work which was cut short in Thessalonica, was it for naught? If we go forward about 7 years, we get an answer to that question. You recall that the church in Jerusalem was suffering economically, and Paul was aware of that. He cared very much for the people back in Jerusalem who had been the ones who started this work. And so he went around to the churches of the Gentiles and raised money to take to Jerusalem. And in writing his second letter to Corinth, here's what he says about the people in Thessalonica, in Berea, and in Philippi as well. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to these churches. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For I can testify they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord and by the will of God to us. So the work in Corinth had, or the work in Thessalonica had been such that these people had grown in their faith rather than being intimidated by the opposition that they continually lived with. The gospel, the love of God for them, the love of God among the saints, among each other, had taken root and had made them a generous people, a people who cared about people they had never seen, who were willing to go beyond what they could afford in making their offering that Paul and others would carry to Jerusalem. Now, another evidence of the strong impact in Thessalonica is the fact that among the people that joined Paul in taking these gifts to Jerusalem was one Aristarchus and another Secundus. We know a lot more about Aristarchus than we do Secundus. Both of these were from Thessalonica, but they were strongly committed, so committed that they left Thessalonica to make this journey to Jerusalem. And coming back to Aristarchus, we see him later traveling with Paul to Rome. You recall that Paul was imprisoned when he took the gifts to the churches in Jerusalem. He was again falsely accused of violating the temple. And Aristarchus stood by his side. He was on the ship going from Caesarea all the way to Rome, the one that went through the major storm. And we find Aristarchus in Rome with Paul as a prisoner. The letter to Colossians says this: Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you greeting. And then the letter to Philemon: Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, and my co-workers greet you. So the work in Thessalonica was not one that died as a result of persecution, but one that thrived. We come back then to our key passage for today from Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, and we are reminded of that last sentence in that passage, which is a good one as we go into the new year. May the Lord direct your hearts and mine to the love of God and to the steadfastness of Christ. I wonder if you have observations or comments on this, what happened in Thessalonica, this epiphany in Thessalonica, if you will.
Steve, how old was Paul when he left on the journey?
To Thessalonica? That was about 50, AD 50. Many people think that he was born about 10 years after Jesus. So he would have been in his mid-40s, I think, at that time. Yes. Any other observation? Yes, Chip?
You know, it's interesting. One thing that's interesting to me about this is we look at the times and we look at and we think of it as, oh, how could they treat these people this way? How could these people treat these people this way? And I think of 1900 years, 2,000 years or so, and how we just become a little more sophisticated in our intolerance of other people's new beliefs.
Yeah.
We don't go out and, well, especially in this country, we don't go out and just kill people, or we don't put them in jail for their beliefs. But what other type of punishments do we give them, for not lack of a better word, by our words, our deeds, our intolerance to listen to their side?
Yes, yes.
We become quite sophisticated.
Yes. Our pastor mentions a book that I want to follow up. It's called Them, and it deals with this very issue that you're talking about, the divide that we experience in our country, and be interested to, this is a senator.
Ben Sass.
Ben Sass, yes. Yes. Other observations? Yes, Bill.
You mentioned the topics that Paul discussed in making the presentations. What documentation do you suppose he carried with him to guide him?
Well, we know that, and this is years later, this is toward the end of his life, from 2 Timothy, when he's writing Timothy to come to Rome because he knows that his time is limited. And we think that he was arrested in Asia Minor, and he left a lot of his things. He had to go quickly with whoever was taking him to Rome. And he asked Timothy, who was the bishop of Ephesus at that time, he said, bring the cloak and the parchments with you. And so I think he carried parchments of the Hebrew Bible, and he may well have had early accounts of the life of Jesus. Luke talks about writing his gospel based on a number of different documents, and so those may have been circulating at that time. And so I think he had some parchments with him. Now, my evidence, there's, in the Thessalonican situation, the scripture doesn't say what his preaching was. What I did was go to his preaching in Antioch of Pisidia. It's in more detail. Luke gives more detail on that, and I thought if he did it there, surely he did it in Thessalonica. And I went forward to his letter to Corinth on the evidence for the resurrection. He did not, that's a later document, but I imagine everywhere he went, he knew that evidence, and he gave it verbally. Quite compelling.
You know, something else I really think is interesting about Paul and some of these guys or they knew their history. They knew where they came from.
Yeah.
They could sit down and discuss that with any rabbi anywhere. But they also knew where their journey was taking them and how it had taken them and how the feeling, the learning. So when they presented this, they were able to refer back to the prophets, different people, all this sort of thing. I don't know all the words. But it was, they were very steeped in their past
Yeah.
to take them on the journey to where they had gone or moved.
Yes, and Paul, young Paul, was so well steeped in the past that his understanding of the past became a stumbling block to begin with, and it was only the encounter with the risen Christ that had him rethink the implications of the past that he had known so well in his study with Gamaliel in Jerusalem.
And because of that, that made him stronger in his new beliefs.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, he understood the opposition in Thessalonica, their zeal, better than anyone, because that had been him. That had